This is Haden Old Hall, also known as the Tudor Hall. It stood here on top of Haden Hill for over 400 years. The family, the Haden family, have been associated with this site since medieval times, and the story is well told and retold that the family came over with William the Conqueror at the end of the 11th century as knights. However, is this the real story? Is that what really happened here on top of Haden Hill? But the question is, when is a Tudor Hall not a Tudor Hall? And as far as Haden Old Hall is concerned, it's when the building is neither Tudor or a hall. Despite the told and retold stories of the Haden family coming to England with William the Conqueror, there is actually absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever. And what we do know now is that actually in Victorian times, the family made up a lot of this history to make their ancestors look that little bit posher. There are lots of myths and legends associated with this building, so come with me on a myth-busting tour and find out more.
The earliest reference to the possible presence of Haydens in Rowley Regis is a document from 1270, which mentions Walter at a Hordern, which probably means Walter at the place of the steep slope. Early references suggest that medieval Haydens were probably local farmers of modest means and that they were named after the place rather than the family giving their name to the site. Whoever the Haydens were at this time, they certainly weren't knights or lords of the manor. We know this because we know exactly who were lords of the manor in the Rowley Regis area at this time and how the estates were being run. We then jump to 1547, which is the first evidence we have of the name evolving into Haden, when the marriage of Alice Haden is recorded in the Rowley Regis Parish Register. It is clear that there were Haydens living in the Rowley area, but we don't know if they lived at Haden Hill or somewhere else. We haven't found any evidence to prove it either way. It seems the wealth of the Haydens grew gradually, and the hall started life as a farmhouse, home to a wealthy farmer known as a yeoman. However, Henry Haden the Elder married Mary Bloomer of Halesowen in 1658, who brought with her a dowry of £600, which was a huge sum of money in the 1650s. In 1683, his son Henry the Younger married Elizabeth Fulwood of Studley, who brought £650 as her dowry and quite a lot of land too. This helped propel our family up the social ladder and probably helped pay for the building or extension of this rather large and smart house, which would have been one of the biggest and best houses in the area. A document from March 1660 shows that Henry Haden the Elder was describing himself as a yeoman, but by 1672 he was calling himself a gentleman, and Henry Haden the Younger acquired a coat of arms. The Haydens had been buying up parcels of land in the local area for some time and renting it out, gradually increasing the wealth and social status of the family. The 1600s were a good time for the middling sort, when many were able to gain wealth, prosperity and position. When Henry Haden died in 1675, he was buried in a family vault in St Giles Church, Rowley Regis. Not bad for a family whose origins were as modest farmers. It is most likely that the hall, roughly as it stands today, was built in the later 1600s, although there may well have been an earlier building on the site, and parts of it may have been incorporated into the current structure. Certainly it is clear from the higgledy-piggledy floor levels, scarring and variety of bricks on the building that it has been much added to and altered over the years. Its long story is written all over it.
We're now in the cellars of the Old Hall, and legend has it that parts of the cellars date back to medieval times. However, there is no evidence of that down here. Most of the brickwork here is of 18th or 19th century. However, there is a small amount of 17th century brickwork in the lower part of this wall. We know that Frederick Bars was a magistrate locally, and it's understood that he would keep people here in this part of the cellar who had undertaken minor misdemeanours, such as being drunk and disorderly. And maybe these brackets are evidence of a strong door which kept those people well and truly locked up. There have long been myths and legends around the house and the hall that there are tunnels which go from the house to what was once Halesowen Abbey or even to Dudley Castle. However, we know that this is absolutely not the case. Tunnels feature a lot in myths and legends all over Europe, and this is just another one of those myths and legends. Another myth and legend that's attached to the house and the hall is the story of Eleanor and the monk. It goes back to medieval times when Halesowen Abbey was just a few miles away from this site. It is said that Eleanor, a local girl, fell in love with a young monk who came from the abbey. However, their love was obviously prohibited. Eleanor was locked up at home, but the monk's fate was much worse. He was bricked up in a tunnel, either one that goes to the abbey from this site, or even in the cellars down here below a much earlier building. It is said that one brick was left so that he could slowly go mad. However, again, this is a story that is attached to many buildings, something very similar. So is the story of Eleanor and the monk real, or just a legend? This is the Great Hall with a fine 17th century fireplace. However, all is not what it seems. This fireplace was actually added in the 1930s and donated by Mr. Joseph Perry when the house was restored. The fireplace is actually a replica of an actual 17th century fireplace which can be found at Stokesay Castle in Shropshire. And this room, which is known as the Great Hall, was never a Great Hall in the 17th century building. It is in fact two rooms which were knocked into one as part of the restoration process to be used as tea rooms and function rooms for weddings. The room below us, which is also a large room now and known as the Cellars, was also two rooms that were knocked into one to create a much larger room. Although it's known as the Cellars, Cellars were actually features of medieval buildings, not 17th century buildings, and were always found on upper floors. So it can never have been a Cellars. As we've mentioned, this was a farmhouse. It wasn't a posh hall. Once again, in the hall's history, a much posher history has been invented for it. The rooms here and downstairs were used as tea rooms and function rooms until the 1960s. The last of the Haden line was John Haden, who died in 1796, and his daughter Anne Eliza Haden. John's young widow Mary married again after John's death, marrying the Reverend George Bars, with whom she had 3 more children. Reverend Bars died in 1840, and Mary herself died in 1844. However, it was in the middle of the Victorian period that the Haydens sold mineral extraction rights on some of their land and became involved with further industrial activities. This brought them far more wealth. After this time, census records tell us that Anne Eliza Hayden and Frederick Bars were both heads of household at the hall. This suggests that the hall was now 2 dwellings. However, we can't tell how long this had been the case. Restoration work in 1977, as well as surveys undertaken by architectural historians, confirm that the house probably was 2 dwellings. However, we have no idea how long this had been the case. George Alfred Haden Haden Best, who was the grandson of the Reverend George Bars, grew up here at the Old Hall with his siblings and his aunt and uncle after the early death of his parents. George Alfred eventually inherited the estate in 1877, and he did not wish to live in the Old Hall. After demolishing an old farmhouse which stood next to the Old Hall, he built a brand new Victorian house. And it is thought that the intention was to eventually demolish this Old Hall and build the other half of his new house. However, an aunt, another Mary Bars, who was the widow of Frederick Bars, still lived here at the Hall. She remained alive until 1904, and it's thought by this point George Alfred could not be bothered to demolish the house and continue with the expansion project on his new Victorian home. Photographs from around 1900 reveal that Mary Bars was living in just part of the hall, the part nearest the dovecote, where the windows and the house look well maintained. Photographs of the other end of the building clearly show that it is in a terrible state of repair, being buttressed with wall ties, wooden props, and the windows are broken and derelict. This supports the idea that the hall was by now 2 separate dwellings. After the death of Mary Bars, George Alfred Haden Haden Best's adopted daughter Alice Cockin and her new husband John Shaw moved here, where they had lived with their 2 sons until Mr. Best died in 1921. At this point, the estate was sold by Mr. Hayden Best's nephews, who had inherited the estate. By October 1922, the Old Hall, Victorian House and Parkland were under the guardianship of Rowley Regis Council, after local people and businesses raised the money to buy the houses and the park. By the middle of the 1930s, the hall was in a ruinous state. This resulted in a major restoration, which culminated with the reopening of the hall on the 27th of October 1937. We know that one of the houses here on Haden Hill was used during World War II to billet evacuees. They were kept here as temporary accommodation before they were allocated a family locally to live with. After some restoration work in 1977, the building suffered a devastating fire, which left it derelict for many years and its future very much uncertain. However, the determination of local people ensured the building was saved, and it was slowly restored and in places largely rebuilt by Sandwell Council's Youth Apprentice Scheme from 1990 onwards. The building was formally reopened in 2005. Haden Old Hall is now in the care of Sandwell Museum Service, part of Sandwell Metropolitan Borough Council. With the support of the Friends of Haden Hill Estate, the hall is open to the public for special events, open days, activities, exhibitions, school projects and more. Sadly, a lot of what you see today around you in the Old Hall is a copy of the building that was originally here, and we cannot tell how much of what remains is actually historic original fabric of this building. However, the history of this building is remodelling, rebirth and rebuilding, as it has been for centuries, and the main thing is that the building is still here.